Hi, everybody. So, welcome to the Second Media Club by Climate Creative. Our topic for this week is going to be zero waste. And we have two sort of resources that we're going to be discussing. One is a video, and the other one is an article. We also have a zero waste expert in our midst. So, we're probably going to be listening to a lot of what he has to say. Um, and yeah, I mean, nothing is off the table here. We're looking forward to everybody's views. And because this is a topic that links into circular economy in a broader aspect as well, that's definitely something we're going to be sort of discussing in this context. Yeah, I think let's get started. Would you guys want to start with the video or the article? I personally love the video, so I sort of really enjoy that. And we also have somebody from Japan who can sort of maybe attest to that or argue with that. So, you know,
Isn't isn't the person in the video your boss, Mitsu? Yeah.
Yeah.
that's
So the
good
person
then.
who's in the video is my current boss right now.
That's very cool. Great. So we already have a connection here. Lovely. Logan, would you like to start with your views on the video?
Yeah, I thought it was really good. So it's interesting because Paris, you selected this and you didn't get to see Mitsu's talk, which I need to send you, but it was so funny that you chose this one, and then it ended up, as I watched it, I was like, oh, this is like where Mitsu works, and like this is like their project. And so it's so funny that you happened to choose this out of everything. um and I thought it was actually really good supplemental information to Mitsu's talk, because Mitsu was talking very much about like how how the organization gets these like municipalities to do the zero waste work. But then this was kind of the emotional side where people were talking about how it actually affected them and how they like um, adapted to being a zero waste community, which is something that I think is like the hard disconnect, right? Like I think about like, wouldn't it be great if everybody around me was like more conscious about zero waste, but like how do you get to do that? And so to see it in action was like a really impactful to me, I think. I don't know, what do you guys think?
Yeah, I mean, I also just sort of adding on to that because you said like it's usually sort of a very sort of hard shift from, going from your current lifestyle to a zero waste lifestyle. So usually what happens, at least in the current climate, what happens is we've sort of got this idea that zero waste things and sort of sustainable things need to be expensive and need to be things that are sort of, one-time investments. And what this video essentially showed was just the power of sort of reusing and recycling. So that was amazing to me because there's this example where he's like, okay, so we used to have these cardboard boxes we used to get for like things that used to be delivered to our shop. And now we use them to sort of either deliver other products or sell other products. You're just using the same object in multiple ways without having to spend any extra money on it, which I think culturally, if you sort of imbibe that into like one culture or into sort of a group of people, that's a very strong way to start off with zero waste because there's no investment needed at all practically. It's just what you have you use for something else. And it's not that hard also in terms of the kind of objects we have at home, right? So for example, I mean, people have started doing that with like mason jars and stuff and sort of making it aesthetic now as well. But ideas like that where something that you wouldn't expect to use for a particular activity you are using now, and that just makes it so much easier for you to then sort of reduce your waste, rather than buying an extra thing, you're just reusing that. And yeah, I think that that's one of the things that I sort of really appreciated in terms of like how easy it is to sort of not spend money and still continue to have like a zero waste lifestyle. um Alexis, do you have something to say?
Yeah, it's kind of tangential, but it reminds me actually of like my upbringing. My parents always joke that like, oh, Mexicans are the original recyclers. I'm just gonna, if it's okay, I'm just gonna share my screen real quick. I just like Googled like Mexican Tupperware meme because you always have, these tubs of like butter. Country crock was a big one, but it's never country crock in there. It's always something else. It's salsa. It's literally they reuse everything. I don't think for a long time, I don't think we even owned like real like Tupperware. We were just reusing what we already bought. And they didn't even think much of it. They didn't think they were like doing something for the planet. It just made sense to do, like economically
Do your parents
Yeah.
still do that at this point, or like, because I what I'm wondering is if it's like still holding on, or if perspectives have shifted.
That's a great question. They do a combination of both. So my mom did get these like, you know, nice glass Tupperware with the airlock lids, but she still uses Cool Whip containers to like send home macaroni salad leftovers with me. So so both.
Mitsu, I actually was wondering, were you around with Zero Waste Japan when the Komikatsu thing started, or did you come in afterwards?
So the Zero Waste Academy has been working for about roughly 19 years, and what was on the video was probably the peak of when the world, a lot of globally and local zero waste enthusiasts were very focused towards and very curious about what Kamikatsu was doing. So you could say it was a latter stage where things were kind of getting, well, a lot of the practices of zero waste where the civilians knew what to do. A lot of practices implementation has been set, and it was the moment to kind of show off to the world of like how well it was well done. But so yeah, I was at the last time. That was like at the end of the era where everything was kind of settling in, and I would say it was like the it was now it's like as a kamikatsu as it currently is trying to redefine the next 10 years, next movement for the next 10 years, including education as well as more collaboration with other municipalities and companies.
So they're keeping it up right now, because I realized this video is in 2017, right? So it's like still going on, and no slippage, no going back the wrong way that you know of.
Absolutely, yeah. We can't. I don't think. Well, I don't think they could go back. Well, I don't think. Well, the truth is, they never had the choice to go back. Because the trouble they had with in the early 2000s with the incinerator. So they just decided to go with zero waste, and now it's been implemented, and
Is
it's
there
been
an
functioning.
event that had made this happen? Like there was some kind of like fire or something? What do you mean, just like the problem with incineration there, or?
Yeah, so they decided to install incineration back in 2000s, like 2000, 1999. And what happened was that at the same year, the national guideline for the amount of pollutants that could be released to the air was put in stricter with a stricter regulation, and the built incinerator didn't meet the national requirement. Therefore, they couldn't use. They built the machine or they built the thing, but they couldn't use it. So they were like, okay, so what's next? What can we do? And yeah.
Huh.
So that was when they had to really shift their focus and identify how can they move the town into a more sustainable one. So it was more like their butt was on fire, if you can say. Yeah.
Yeah, that actually sort of does actually remind me of, Logan, do you want to say something? Okay. That actually does remind me of this one sort of article that I read somewhere, which basically said, there's something called social tipping points that you have. So you have climate tipping points, and then you have social tipping points, which is essentially one sort of one defining moment, or one defining event, which basically gets people to sort of, cross that threshold and be like, okay, we've had enough. That's it. We just start something new now. So I feel like a lot of sort of bigger cities have probably faced those social tipping points already. But it's just that because there's no sort of effort, I'd say, from like city management or from the state to sort of start off with something that's at a city level, rather than having like private entities or NGOs or something like that start off. That's I think that's what people struggle, because there is no lack of tipping points at all. You'll always hear about sort of so particularly for India, I think in Delhi, when you sort of enter Delhi by road, there's this giant landfill that they have, which, I mean, if you Google Delhi landfill, you will see images of that which you do not want to see. It is just the worst thing to see when you enter a city, and that's the national capital. So not only sort of does it ruin all the sort of localities around Delhi, because it the sort of smells, the diseases, all of that. So there's so many negative connotations to that. But it's that one city that produces so much waste that it doesn't even bother sort of dealing with at all. It's just pushed out to the outskirts of the city. So that has been brought up in argument so many times in terms of like, we need to stop this from happening. We need to. So that tipping point has been crossed so many times. But because there is no sort of set guide or set rules that is coherent across the city, I think people sort of struggle to do that. You have your sort of regular dry waste and wet waste segregation and all that stuff, but like you see, so even in the video when you see, there's like what, about 46 or 45 categories that they have in terms of what to recycle, how and where, and that has come from so many years of doing that, right? So the idea essentially should be to maybe start off with, let's say, 5 categories at most, and have people be like, okay, if you segregate them by these 5 categories, the rest will be done by us. And then slowly you can increase that maybe by 2 steps or 3 steps, saying, okay, now you need to segregate this into 10 categories. And that doesn't have to be on a city level at all. That has to be maybe one locality or one society or one sort of smaller area, which then can be, which makes it easier even for sort of waste collection to happen across the city, essentially. So you can have one van that just collects recyclables, one van that collects other stuff, all of that stuff. So I think it's just sad that we've missed so many tipping points when it comes to that, because as Mitsu was saying, like here, because of that one incineration thing, people immediately thought, okay, that's our goal now. No, this is not something we want to use anymore. Now we're switching to this. And I feel like even in general, maybe it's also sort of the sort of human behavior that has a role to play there, because at least for countries like more developing countries, I think people are still in that mindset where they're like, we deserve these luxuries. We haven't done anything to contribute to climate change, so we deserve to do all of this that the people in the West are doing. And I mean, I don't necessarily agree with that, because that sort of brings in that whole idea of spite, essentially, because you are not doing anything sort of wonderful by using all of this plastic and being all luxurious with this plastic, essentially. So you can feel the same way by using sustainable objects and sustainable sort of items as well. But yeah, I think that's why we, as sort of, at least in the global south, end up struggling a lot with like social tipping points, because it's always, yeah, we get it, that has happened, but we don't feel like doing this because we haven't been involved in creating the problem at all. And I think that's something that needs to be drilled in people's minds, where they're like, we know you might not be responsible for the problem, but you can be a part of the solution. That's never a bad point to start off, right? So, yeah, that went on for a bit. Anybody has any comments on that?
I was actually, you were talking earlier about like how it started, and it made me wonder what the specific infrastructure of this town is. And like, I think the video, like Logan, you're kind of right, it did focus on more the emotional side. But I was also kind of wondering like what all the gritty details are, like what do you do with food waste? And like, how is that collected? And like, the recycling center, like you guys, I assume, like had to build a whole separate like recycling center just for this town, right?
So the nitty gritty part. Well, this is some. Well, okay. So first, to kind of like, play, kind of advance with what Paris mentioned. One of the challenges with any kind of zero waste or sustainability, is that sustainability by itself is not attractive enough to the local populace most of the time. Therefore, it needs to bring in other societal or I guess a social welfare aspect incorporated, or economical benefit, which would significantly improve people's livelihood. And a lot of the discussion which was held in Kamikatsu and any other community that we talk to really depends on, yes, zero waste, yes, circular economy, yes, those are important, but what are the other improvement can you bring to the community? And there's a lot of opportunities in that spectrum. And one of which, with especially with Kamikatsu, I think, was how the community center or the recycling waste collection center became a sector in the community where people would come around and just have a little chit chat and kind of have like a quick follow up on how people are doing. And then what happened was that it became abundant that, well, the elderly, who's around like 70, 60 or 60 to 80, can't really like drive their car to drop their luggage, waste off at the waste collection center. So they had to come up with a way to, instead of asking them to come to the waste collection center, we had to find staffs who will go drive up there, talk to them, catch up with them, and pick up the waste and come back. So, I think those kind of social aspects, which are usually not incorporated within the traditional economic measurement with like GDP. What else are there? Like something like that, right? So in that aspect, I think there's a lot of improvement that we think they are, but it's not quantified yet. So those are like I think the key aspect when it comes to, especially to any other community that doesn't really need to do zero waste, like right ahead, like, they don't have any incentives. So I guess the challenge is how can we create that incentives to drive the community for better community development in that sense. I hope I answered your question, Lauren, in that regard.
Well, I mean, I was looking up just now Kamikatsu's population density. I mean, on Wikipedia as of September 2020, the estimated population is only 1,344 people. So it's like a relatively small place. So that makes it so much easier. I guess there's only one sorting facility that's kind of downtown. That's the thing that like, I keep trying to picture this on a much wider scale, right? Like that it's like in a city. I feel like you'd need so many of those sorting facilities. You would need so much education for all the people about how to do it. But when there's only 1,000 people, I feel like it's not as hard to educate and talk them into it, Lauren, I was wondering about because since you're in Durham, right? Or Durham, right? What's Durham's, like, they're pretty good, right? I like about recycling, composting. Do you have composting there?
We don't. I actually looked it up after reading the articles and stuff. There was a survey back in 2019 to see if like there's interest in composting. And I think it's been kind of put on hold with COVID. So it's like something that's in the works, but we don't have it yet. And recycling, that was another thing I was trying to find information on, and like it's kind of vague as to where it's done and like is it shipped off or do we do it here? And that's kind of something that like I noticed just looking at like trying to find information for my city and like cities that were in the article, is that like I feel like there's not a lot of like clear information.
Yeah, that's interesting. Because like after watching this video, I was like so inspired and I was like, I want this to happen everywhere. And actually, I don't know if you guys want to start shifting into talking about the next article, but I thought it was really interesting because that whole article was really meant and written for city employees, right, who want to start shifting to a zero waste perspective. And I thought it was cool that you could like look up your city and see how much waste they were diverting. I don't know if you guys did it, but I'm in San Francisco and we were like the best in the Northern Hemisphere or whatever. We're like diverting 89% of our, yeah, no, but we're supposedly diverting 89% of our waste, which is pretty good for a city. But I don't know. I have another thought, but it's like totally tangential. So maybe it's like related to Paris's thing, but I'll come back to it later maybe.
Yeah. No, I mean, yeah, that makes total sense. I mean, in terms of how different these perspectives were, in terms of like having like a little locality, and on the other hand, having like an entire map for how to do this for a city. One more thing that I said, I think Mitsu also brought up was the idea that these plans need to be made very sort of geography specific and culture specific, because that really helps in terms of implementing them. Like, for example, and also like Alexis was saying, there's so much that's integrated into our cultures. Like, for example, at least in India, when you go to like street vendors who sort of sell food, or just mainly sort of smaller shops, you'll always see they'll never give you plastic bags. You'll have bags that are either made from like recycled paper, or just old newspapers, old textbooks, just anything that's paper related. And that's easy to use. You can just throw it away. It's biodegradable very easily, all of that stuff. So the thing there is that these smaller businesses, these smaller sort of places have already been doing that for a while. It has been sustainable for them. It has been something that they've sort of integrated into their cultures. So when we say stuff like, oh, it might be very difficult for people to change their habits, what we don't realize is people have already been doing that for a while. So the only thing we need to do is just provide more incentive to continue that. And there's this one sort of like one statement that I was thinking of where people are like, sometimes the ideal is the enemy of the achievable. And what
Oh,
we tend to do is we sort of have this idea where we're like, that's what we want and that's what we should directly sort of aim for. When we already have things that are in our reach that we can easily sort of start off with, essentially. So I think doing that, making it culture specific, making so for cultures that sort of end up producing like a lot of food waste, you can just push maybe, which I think cultures already do, which you have sort of a strong sense of composting, at least in sort of South Asian cultures. There's this idea that okay, all of this food waste will go into this one compost pit that practically everybody that I know has, essentially. So using those cultural cues and those cultural ties that people have to the earth and to sort of waste management in general, and then promoting these sort of activities, I think really helps, rather than asking them to completely make a behavioral change and just completely shift to a newer technology of waste management or something like that. you know yeah. Yeah, any comments from anybody?
Really like that quote, sometimes the ideal is the enemy of the achievable. I feel like as a very optimistic person, I often, that is something that I can like get caught up in. And that's a good, like, bring it back down a notch, bring it back to reality. And that's a really good point. I appreciate you saying that.
I mean, I was actually I'm sorry to be speaking too much, but I was actually in a call with people from sort of one of the state governments in India. And it was very interesting to know that they also had the same perspective. Like, usually you have people sort of aiming for the best and being like, this is what we want to achieve in the next 5 years. These people are like, listen, this is the equipment that we have. So they were talking about countering air pollution, obviously. But they were like, this is the equipment that we have. We can't wait around for better stuff. If we start doing what we can right now, then later we can update it, or later we can sort of, once we get funding from people, all of that stuff, we can do what we want and what we aim to do later. But we need to act on this now, just to sort of set up a basic infrastructure for the future, essentially. So I think it's really interesting to see that even government officials and governments have this idea where they're like, immediate action is needed, and we can develop on that in the future. We don't need to wait around for something better to come out, essentially. Yeah.
I think
Logan, Mitzi,
yeah,
anything?
so this kind of brings it back to where something that you were saying, I think it connects to something you were saying earlier, which is talking about the social tipping points. And I find that really interesting. I think about those all the time. Like, there are moments that catalyze action, right? And it's interesting, we're talking about zero waste and reuse and things. One of the articles that I suggested, but maybe I'll put it in the resource archive or something, is this PBS thing about the history of recycling, like where it came from. And so it talks about how it really, in America at least, it really happened because there was like a ship that there was so much waste that was being made in New York City. And this guy had this idea, well, we should take all the waste in New York City and I could bring it down to Kentucky where I have all this land and I could incinerate it to make energy. So he was like trying to make an energy incineration thing. And so he was actually trying to do a good kind of like it was supposed to be environmentally friendly-ish and, you know, like do something good with the waste. Well, what happened was he had this barge with waste on it going down the coast of America, and people would see it going down and they were disgusted by the waste, and they had like helicopters flying over and being like, oh my gosh, look at this waste that we don't want it in Kentucky, like take it back to New York. And there were like myths about like, oh, there's like, you know, it's like waste from like hospitals and it's going to get us sick and all this kind of stuff. And so he ends up bringing it back to New York. Like he tries and tries, and it takes like months and months and spends so much money. And then he has to bring it back to, they decide that he has to bring it back to New York, and like Greenpeace was there and they had a big banner that said like, we should do better with our waste. And then recycling kind of became a thing after that. Isn't that crazy? And so it was like this like national, watching this ship moving a bunch of waste, like the visibility of the amount of waste was the social catalyzing moment that kind of started the recycling movement in America. And so I think you're right, there's like these social tipping points that we need to catalyze on. And I think I went to Naomi Klein, who, well, she's written a bunch of things. What's her famous one? Like, where do we go from here, or something?
Yeah.
This changed everything. And there's the other one also, right? The No Logo. I think No Logo is also written by her.
And there's also like On Fire, the Green New Deal or something like that. But so I heard her speak about that one particularly, and she was talking, I thought this was interesting, about how think tanks have traditionally been conservative organizations, or like in America initially were conservative organizations, and that think tanks spend their time creating policy for things that haven't happened yet pretty often. And so like when there's like a mass shooting or something like that in America, then like the conservative gun think tank will already have legislation that they've already like thought about and put it up basically to be voted on. And they use those events as catalyzing moments to get across the things that they want to get done. You know, there's like lots of other stuff hidden in there and everything like that. And that unfortunately the left does not do that as well. They don't use catalyzing moments, although it is like extremely cynical. It's kind of like there needs to be this pre-planning way to utilize moments to get across like beneficial change. So anyway, I just think that's interesting. And it was interesting that you were saying that, you know, maybe part of the reason like the global South struggles with that is because, what was your can you remind me what your theory was?
Yeah, it was essentially that if we're not responsible for it, why should we act on it? You know, I think that's one approach that just is the worst approach to take, essentially, because I mean, of course, there's this sort of entire history of colonialism, you know, all of that factoring into this, but why would you refuse to be a part of the solution, particularly when that's doing good things for you? You know, it's not like it's sort of affecting you negatively in any way. And I think visibility, like you said, visibility ends up being one of the sort of most important factors in terms of getting people to change their decisions, essentially. Like, for example, imagine if you sort of, if nobody came to ever collect your waste, or if you never sent your waste to the recycling, like you would see piles and piles of it every month outside your house. You would not like that. So if you had to do that, if let's, even if you consider that as in sort of extreme scenario, like keeping that in mind and then acting on your sort of needs in terms of like what you consume, how you consume it, what kind of packaging it comes in, all of that, even that sort of is a good starting point, you know, essentially. Is being like, if nobody came to collect my waste, what would I do? So why can't I live a life like that even when somebody comes to collect it, you know, essentially? Yeah,
Alexis,
see, like,
you should say it. Or what do you
Close it
know
up.
about it?
That actually happened in Lebanon. In 2015, they stopped collecting the garbage. Like, I was studying abroad, and one of the people there was from Lebanon, and she was like, oh my God, like this is happening. And like they just, nobody was picking it up, and it just started piling up, and it was like in their like waterways. And I think it went on for a really long time, like months, if not a year. Yeah, I'll have to like touch base with her and like see how that ended up working out, and like how they changed, like how they shifted, because I know they also relied on like plastic bottled water because they're like water also like they couldn't drink it. So there was all of that. Yeah, I'm gonna ask her about that. I actually don't know how that like changed the way that they used materials and produced waste.
It's an interesting case study potentially, right?
Yeah, I
I
actually
mean,
did sort of a quick article about it. So if you want it, it literally says Lebanon is drowning in its own waste, which is, well, you don't want to be that, you know. Um, yeah. Any other comments from anybody?
So I
Otherwise,
do think, to kind of sum it up, with like there's like two kinds of tug of war is happening, especially when it comes to the ideal versus practicality, and the kind of like a north and south. I think that one of the commonality or the common denominator is when we talk about systematic change. We're talking about, we need to change our society, we need to change our production, yada yada yada. I think what's more important is that we really need to redefine how this change is supposed to happen, and what kind of criteria that we've been using. The I think when the reason why the zero waste practices in circular economy, to a certain extent, it's impractical, is because it takes a lot of time if you want to do this correctly. And this includes, it's not that, we've tried, we want to define what kind of potential future there are, but we really need to define what kind of society these community wants to thrive in. So I think one of the greatest recent work is definitely Kate Wordsworth in Donuts Economy, where they try to redefine their own, what was the word they used? Not wealth, thriving, thriving city, which means, like, to have their inner people be living well with, like, beyond just like GDP, or just whatever KPI that's been traditionally used, but to use different kind of measurement, maybe potentially happiness and such. Therefore, when we talk about the ideal versus practical, I think I don't really mind the concept of post-scarcity society, where there's the opposite of where we at, where they just totally define it as the abundance of everything. The automation, technology will basically technocrat, and and a lot of the I've heard of a lot, I've heard about these stories from a lot from the West Coast, some from England, some from very well-known AI experts. But they'll just talk about how technology will solve a lot of these current issues, and I don't mind with that. But I still do think, like, we need to find the alternative way, which is kind of really based on the culture and tradition that we actually had, and because in some way that was sustainable to some degree, right? Because we used to eat something that was grown within like maybe 20 to 30 miles maximum, maybe. We would never go across the overseas and such. And I think it's important that, like, as society, we have give enough space or diversify our way of developing our own, community and such. And therefore, when it comes to North and South issues, I think there's a lot of work needs to be done, especially in the Europe, United States, as well as Japan, Korea, and some level, because we do kind of do this green imperialism, where we kind of push our technology and say, oh, we got the best solutions. Where there's a lot of talk about learning from the indigenous communities. There's a lot of discussion about learning from them of how to do a proper forest maintenance and such. So there needs to be understanding of that. And at the same time, I do kind of want the South to be hinted that the current development model did not work. And it's a great opportunity to kind of skip the mess that we got ourselves, basically the high income countries got themselves into, and kind of really skip that, and find more sustainable jump for their society, and to be, if they want to be economic competitive, I'm sure they can. That's I think also, looking at how the phones, for example, and if you look at Kenya, bankings and mobile communication are all integrated through. Mobile banking is the common thing, where in Japan we still use paper money. That's kind of like not tech enough, right? So I think there's a lot of potentials, and also so that's where I'm trying to get. I think there's a lot of potential for the South to find alternative development model beyond the traditional one.
Yeah, I think that's very true. Like I said, there's always this race to sort of be what the West is and be sort of where the West was, which Mitsu very correctly pointed out needs to be changed in terms of like just the outlook of people and how they approach sort of the future essentially. Um, yeah, I think if everybody's done with their comments on this one, we can probably move on to the next next piece now, the article. Alexis is very excited about it, apparently. um, but oh, okay, no worries, no worries. I think we have enough experts here to sort of fill you up. That's very cute. Can we see your cat, please? Or does she not like to be picked up?
She
I
just
love that.
walked away.
That's the
She
most
does what she
important
wants.
question. Can we see your cat, please? I love that.
She's my housemates, but I like to pretend she's mine sometimes.
Yeah, anyways, Logan, do you want to start with the piece?
I can, yeah. I was at first, when I first looked at this article, I was like, oh, is this gonna be long enough or interesting enough? But actually it's just like cram packed with a lot of really interesting stuff. I think the thing that hit me the most was the statistics. Like, I think that the main one was that what does it say? Waste disposal, particularly methane released from organic waste in landfills, is responsible for about 5% of the total greenhouse gas emissions of a city. And I'm like, that is, or no, like in the world, but cities particularly. And that cities like Mexico City, that's actually a much higher portion of their greenhouse gas emissions. And that's a lot, dude. Like, we can lower that if cities would just compost. Like, I don't know, the composting thing just makes so much sense to me. And Alexis just wrote compost. Maybe you should talk about composting a little bit. But when I read this, I was like, composting is so important, and it's so sensical, right? Like, it's so common sense to me that like we have this stuff and we can turn it into something else that can grow food. Like, why is every city not investing in that infrastructure? I don't understand. So anyway, that was my big takeaway.
Just sort of bouncing off of that, recently I think there was this thing in Portland where apparently one of these companies sort of put out a lot of food in the dumpsters, and people who went dumpster diving were sort of being hounded by the police essentially for going dumpster diving. Which, I mean, how is that? How I cannot, I can't, my brain can't function to try and understand how that works. It's not like anybody's using that anymore. It's ultimately going to end up going to the trash. There's people who are willing to sort of, I mean, there's people who need it, number one. And there's people who are willing to sort of use it for other purposes, put it in food banks, whatever, all of these other reasons. And how you can have sort of legal action or sort of police action on something like that. I mean, those are the sort of ideals that we need to basically put away and be like, how can you have police action for something that's literally not illegal at all? Like, that's something that actually is serving a good purpose for these people essentially. But yeah, anybody
Yeah,
else?
I went to when I was in college, I had a friend that would dumpster dive in Panera's dumpsters and would just like come home with like a giant bag of like day-old bread or something. And because of that, Panera started locking their dumpsters, like putting a padlock on it because so they could throw away the bread, which is just insane.
and
Why
there
are
was
people so possessive over their trash? It's so silly.
And
they
yeah,
want you to pay for it, but like the people who are willing to dumpster dive for food we're never going to pay for it anyway. Let's be real. Like,
and if it's ultimately going to end up going into the trash, like, how does it matter to you at all? If
Mm-hmm.
you're going to throw it out, you might as well just. And I think even so, when we even discuss like Scandinavian countries and stuff who are sort of going supposedly ideal in the sustainability aspect. There's somebody I think that we can check out called Matt Homewood, I think. Basically what he does is I think he lives in Copenhagen. Every time he sees sort of material that's either going to be expired soon or just stuff that's been put out by supermarkets in terms of in the um, sort of almost expired pile, he brings it back home, and every day he posts a picture of how much stuff he's got from one supermarket. And if you look at that, you'll sort of the amount is staggering. And it's so crazy to see that so much of this food just and so much of this stuff just goes into waste. I think it's called Matt Homewood.
I
I can,
found him. Do you want to
yeah,
screen share it?
yeah. Are you doing it or should I?
You can, or I don't care. If you have trouble getting it up, I can do it.
Yeah, I think you can put it up. I'll have to search for him. But
Oh, sure. It's really interesting. Like can you guys see?
yeah,
Okay.
so that's stuff he doesn't. The number of things that he brings back are insane, and all of this is from like maybe one supermarket or one day's of worth of work. All of that stuff.
So what does he do with this? Do you know like what he ends up
so
doing?
sometimes he gives it off to like food banks and stuff, and other times he either sort of just gives it off to people saying, I have all of this stuff, on apps like Too Good To Go and stuff like that. He's like, if any of you want, you can just sort of take it away. But the amount was amazing to me. Like, that's a lot of food.
It is. The eggs, for some reason, the eggs are like really, I don't know. It's a lot of eggs. That's a lot of like, I don't know.
Yeah, and then this whole sort of idea of putting expiry dates and stuff and having them. And actually, I think this was the UK government that basically came up with a new sort of idea where they were like, instead of sort of having expiry dates on products, we're going to encourage people to like smell it and see if it seems off, or taste it and see if it seems off, rather than sort of just having this one date that people go by and then just throw it off when it's expired. So I think that's very interesting, because that's what people used to do in the old. You didn't have expiry dates like maybe 400, 500 years ago, right? You just used to see it and used to be like, okay, this seems off. I might not use it again. Something like that. So I feel like going back to those older sort of ways, like a lot of people mentioned, using those senses and using those things to sort of reduce waste is probably something that cities are experimenting with right now, and that's very interesting to see. Yeah. Yeah.
I do
Anybody
think
else?
when it comes to, food, is that I tend to look at it like as of there's like 6 steps that we can do. One is definitely the reduction in itself, and I think this is the most challenging one, because we have to ask the entire global supply chain to fix their own mess. But after that, I think there's a few layers, which is the societal, welfare aspect. Then and then there's like also feeding the animals to some degree, then composting it. But I think the challenge of the food reduction is I think the biggest challenge, I think, is the diversity versus um the food variety within a specific community. um and this is mainly because there's a lot of talk, for example, about halal based, so food that so the Muslim people can eat. And we don't have that kind of production, or we can't even provide them the original taste that was like in homeland, or when we have to import them sometime from all over the world. And in some cases, when we talk about cultural heritage of the food, in order to, and I think oral tradition is one way to kind of pass down your family and cultural tradition, but at the same time, food is another crucial way. And it's a challenge of being globalized and being that you're living in a diversified city, is that because of if we, in the name of sustainability, and if we start closing down a lot, if we start restricting the amount of food that's available, then that could also potentially damage the passing down, or the tradition that was originally meant for these families who are coming all the way from Philippines to work in Japan, or vice versa. So those are the dilemmas that I've been thinking when it comes to tackling this global supply chain with food. but yet we live in a society where it's so diverse, and we want to celebrate that plurality with different kind of cultures. So I don't know. Those are the dilemmas I've been thinking about these days.
It's interesting. I mean, I think some things, like I think about avocados a lot as an example, because like they're so prevalent in the US now as like something that everybody wants, but most of them are grown like in Southern California or Mexico, right? And so, I mean, for California, it's not so far to like ship some avocados, but you know, when you're getting them to Maine, maybe that's a little bit far or something, right? But and I don't know, like I don't know enough about this, but like greenhouses are a way that you can make things in other places, but I think they're like can be energy, need a
They're
lot of
very
energy.
yeah, absolutely.
What would you say?
They're very energy intensive.
Right. So it's not exactly a great alternative. I mean, I don't know. It's just interesting. Like, I think the best thing, like you did your whole climate creative project on agriculture, right? And your points were like, eat the local foods in season. I mean, I think part of that is a culture shift that we need to have where we're like, you know how people are excited about pumpkin spice lattes when it's like October time? I feel like we need to be like excited because it's like blueberry season or whatever, and then like we need to be excited because it's squash season, or like when Nick and I lived in Korea for a year, like there was like kimchi packing season. Like it was like that time of year, families got together, they made their kimchi, and then they like waited, and then like there was like kimchi unboxing time or whatever. I mean, people ate kimchi all year round because it's like, but there were kind of these like events around it that made you excited for like a certain type of food. And I think if we like would cultivate that type of thinking, we could shift people to eating more local and seasonal potentially.
Yeah. Alexis?
What Logan said just reminded me of something that I'm reading right now. I think, Lauren, you've read Braiding Sweetgrass, right?
Yeah.
It's so good. But just this conversation is reminding me about what like Robin Wall Kimmerer has said about reciprocity and appreciation and gratitude. And sorry, I just lost my train of thought. But like what Logan was saying about like celebrating, like, oh, you know, it's kimchi season, like let's celebrate and like do this. And then, you know, when the season is over, you know, you're it's, I don't know, it's special because it's seasonal. And I think that goes hand in hand with like, I don't know, just gratitude for the land and appreciating, you know, what's provided. And yeah, you know, that thought wasn't fully formed. It was kind of half baked, but I just wanted to throw that out there. Everybody should read Braiding Sweetgrass. It's so good.
Yeah, just kind of like, sorry, just kind of like how she talks about like how we, like in a capitalist model, it's all extractive, and it's kind of like, what can the land do for me versus like, what can I do for the land? And that what the land gives back to me is a gift. And yeah, I think that's like a really interesting idea, especially with like zero waste and like trying to not only just like consume less, but like trying to have it like be a relationship almost.
I worry, or I wonder like that we're almost, this like ties back to me to like technology. And so I think like, you know, caring about nature and like slowing down and things like that are like societal shifts, right? And I think that technology has our brains so programmed for instant gratification that it makes it really hard, it will make it really hard to make those shifts that we need to, right? Like as a society, right? Like like I watched that thing on Netflix, I forget what it's called, but it's all about like how you're like how technology has us hardwired, like it sends you notifications when it knows you're lonely, like it knows like, you know, your habits, and it like can make you answer your phone and stuff like that when when like apparently like Instagram, for instance, will delay sending you notifications about like people liking or whatever your pictures until they know that you've like stopped using your phone for a little bit, and then it'll send you a notification to get you to look at your phone again. Even though like somebody liked it earlier, it's not like instantaneous. And so they do that to like keep you like in their system and all that kind of stuff. And like that's totally messing up our brains. And I feel like that's totally messing up our ability to get more in sync with nature's like actual cycles and the things that we need to do to shift our perspectives to be like kamikatsu, or to even want to implement the zero waste hierarchy that was like in this article. Like I don't know. What do you guys think about that? Do you think we're like too far gone? Or like, how do we make those kind of shifts?
One point that I sort of in relation to that I also was sort of thinking of bringing up was, maybe this might not directly answer your question, Logan, but just in general, you know how sort of we just discussed that maybe, when you sort of consume less and you consume more local and seasonal, sometimes, like Mitsu said, you sort of miss out on the cultural sort of variations, or the cultural sort of changes that you see from. So let's say if you order something that you've never tried before, and you sort of wondering if that sort of has more emissions and stuff like that. But the idea there is, when you, I mean, this is more on the development and climate side, but the idea there is, at least for like smaller restaurants and smaller places that are sort of owned by families and stuff, not only does that help the family, the idea behind what they cook and how they cook and stuff is essentially using all the resources you have to the best, in the best capacity possible. So at least what we do at home usually, um, and in general, sort of the idea of cooking in your own household usually has sort of the least amount of waste, because your idea there is, I bought all of this, I will try to use it as best as possible, right? So having that be integrated into like bigger systems essentially, and sort of pushing that idea out, then usually sort of helps, in terms of um so that helps you explore not only the cultural aspect, but also sort of make sure that you're sort of either going to a restaurant or approaching a place where that not all of the food that you're going to be eating, or not all of the contents they're going to be using are going to go out to waste and stuff like that. So the idea that you can use those little activities that you don't even notice when you're cooking at home, maybe like, to me it physically hurts when I have to put something into the trash. Like, I'm like, I bought this, a while ago, I really enjoyed it, so why should I sort of throw it away? So doing those sort of things, I think, when you take that from that culture and have that sort of go around as general practice, that's something that I think can be really effective in terms of maintaining that cultural aspect of things, while also trying to be sort of I wouldn't say carbon neutral, but while also trying to be more sustainable. And so then that does, like, you don't have to feel bad about sort of not being able to go out and eat this kind of cuisine again, just because it's too much sort of, it's too emissions intensive or something like that. Like, of course, the resources, where it comes from and all of that, of course, matters in terms of like shipping and all of that. But the thing is, you can avoid so much of the emissions that you sort of, that restaurants usually have, the bigger restaurants usually have, from these smaller activities that you have on a more household level, that you can expand to other levels essentially. So it's just a random thought that, that I thought of, but yeah. um
It's interesting. I wish Mitsu heard that perspective. When he gets back, we'll have to give him a short version. But no, it's interesting. It also goes back to me. I want to like bring up Korea again. There was something they would do like delivery where it would be in like real bowls and like plates and use real silverware. And so they'd like bring it to you and you would eat it. And then when you're done, you put it outside. And then later somebody would go around and get everybody's bowls and plates and like reuse it again. And I always kind of wondered like, oh, that's great, but I wonder about the emissions of having to like drive around afterwards. But I still think it is better to do that, because if somebody's going and getting a whole bunch of them all at once, it's not like they like are running back and forth every single time, like they would the initial delivery. And like you would leave it out there and be out there for like, I don't know, 3 or 4 hours, and then somebody would come get it or whatever. So I just feel like that was also a more pleasant way to eat too. You're just like had a real thing in front of you, and it just like they would put like plastic covers or something, like if it was a soup, but like other than that it was kind of just like in this like big delivery box that they would have, and then they'd like give you the tray with all the food on it. So like, that's better too, why don't we just do that?
Absolutely. And it even sort of feels so nice to hear about these things, you know. Like if somebody were to do that in my city, I'd be so glad. Like it's these small things that are sort of part of these cultures that you can very easily sort of imbibe into your own culture. But the only thing is people are a little sort of wary about it in terms now either people don't know about it in terms of the awareness, you know, of course, because I found out about this like from you. So having people know about stuff like this, having people know about these, the thing is, we never looked at them as sustainable techniques, right? It was just something that we used to do, like Alexis said. So using like Tupperware and all of that, so using all these other boxes in place of Tupperware, all of that stuff. For us, that's just normal, common practice. But then once you actually end up, because I feel like in a few years, everything is going to be about climate change, essentially. Everything we do will have some or the other relation to climate change. So once we start sort of breaking down these activities that we do on a daily basis, I feel like that will also, I mean, it's a matter of time, but that will also end up sort of increasing the exposure that we have to these kinds of solutions that are more sort of culturally specific, but that can be taken up in other places as well, you know.
Mhm.
Could you just sort of reiterate your point that you had, the question that you had, if you remember?
I just was like stoked to share that part, I think, about like that it's just my question was like, oh, I wonder if the emissions, I
No,
wonder if
before
it's
that.
better to do that. Oh, before that? I don't remember actually.
Yeah, never mind.
Um,
Is Alexis coming back?
she said she lost, her internet went out. So we'll see.
Okay.
But let's see. Does anybody have anything else about the article that they found like particularly interesting? I feel like there were some really interesting statistics and things in there.
It something that it kind of made me wonder, and maybe this is kind of more of a like semantics question, but like there was a lot of cities that they listed at the bottom that were saying like zero waste by 2030, 2040. And like a lot of them were especially like bigger cities. And I was wondering like, can especially like a big city be truly like zero waste? Like, especially with the hazardous materials and like building and construction materials and everything, like, is that accurate to say that they're going to be zero waste?
Isn't there a difference between zero waste and like negative waste or something like that? Sorry, go ahead,
Well,
Mitsu.
so zero waste as more of like the fundamental idea, it has two meaning, right? One is the waste diversion away from incineration as well as landfill. And the benefit of having a massive population is that, you know, the amount of waste that's especially in the urban areas, especially you know, when you consider it, is that amount of waste that's going to be produced will be massive, which means that there's a lot of potential for waste to energy facilities. So this doesn't necessarily mean incineration, but it also could mean biogas, fermentation based, you know, generators and such. So when they talk about zero waste as more of like, you know, more, and you know, we also need to separate between a household waste versus a business waste. I don't know if that's a separation that has in, you know, outside of Japan, but in Japan we separate them into household versus the companies or business-based waste. So I think usually when zero waste is incorporated within urban cities, I think they should hint on how they want to achieve circular economy with a set, because I don't think it's possible to, like what Lauren said, you know, with construction materials. I think it's very difficult. But the benefit of doing it in the urban is actually a lot easier because you could actually generate enough waste to do something, to make something and make actually economically viable solution.
Yeah, adding on to that a little bit, like how sort of the idea of carbon offsets, I mean, this is probably not the best example to give, but the idea of carbon offsets essentially, and, sort of going carbon neutral, which is basically we're going to try to reduce our emissions as much as possible, but obviously some emissions that we can't reduce. So, in order to sort of overcome that, we're going to be offsetting them essentially. And I know that's been misused and misconstrued in a lot of ways, but sort of bringing that idea to zero waste essentially, and not maybe having it be entirely zero, because there's obviously going to be some waste that you can't necessarily sort of reduce or recycle or something like that. But sort of not in the short term at least. In the longer term, maybe you can, when you change sort of the kind of materials you use and stuff. But in the shorter term, I think sort of doing something to offset that would probably sort of um, be a good way to go about in terms of like local policies as well. Lauren, Alexis, Logan, any thoughts?
I think I was trying to find it quickly, but I saw something the other day that was explaining the difference between like zero waste, negative waste, waste positive. I don't know. They're just like different terms that people are using to mean different things. And I was surprised because maybe it wasn't waste positive, but it was something positive, that the term basically meant like the ideal world situation where you're actually like not just doing less.
Oh, yeah. I know
What
what
is
that is.
that?
Eco efficiency versus eco effectiveness.
But it's like actually kind of like carbon offsets. It's like bringing, or not just like offsetting, but actually creating.
Yeah. So I think one of the great example is Cradle to Cradle resource institution. They coined that term really well. That when we talk about our current sustainability, is that we are always talking about how do we do less impact to the environment, but we're not talking about how do we regenerate or bring positive impact to the environment. So that's why they separate, or at least Cradle to Cradles, they separate into two sections. So eco efficiency is like how well do you conserve your energy, whereas what they are trying to achieve is eco effectiveness, which is to bring how do we bring more positive impact to the environment. So um, it has a very I like their graph a lot, and you could really be critical of of how well the business operations, when business are saying they're just trying to be sustainable, it's a great way to kind of judge them on how well they're doing, because in the end, ultimately, no matter how much carbon offsetting, no matter how much um, impact efficiency eco efficiency you provide, you're still damaging the earth. Like, that doesn't change the fact. And if you start scaling, so if this is related to the size of the business or any entity, but if you start scaling that into a massive amount, then obviously the amount of impact that would be tremendous. So I think that's why it's important for any new upcoming social entrepreneurs and such to really be mindful of where's that line, or where you will lose that effective, where you want to be at least zero, like eco efficiency to zero, maybe 0.1 to eco effectiveness, right? But scaling is usually the challenge of any social entrepreneur, because once you start scaling, that would increase the impact that you have, no matter how positive you think you are doing.
I think this conversation's been really interesting to me because it has pinged in so many different directions. Because I mean, there's just the idea of zero waste is just so intertwined with all of our systems, right? It's intertwined with our economy, it's intertwined with how we live our daily lives, it's intertwined with our food systems. Like, it's intertwined with everything. And so it's such a daunting subject because of that, right? Like, I want to like bust off and be like, capitalism makes it really hard because like we have to scale. Like, Mitsu, you were just saying scaling, right? Like, the only way you can really be an effective business these days and like make a lot of money and employ a lot of people is by being able to like create something at scale that can be delivered to tons of people over the world. And like the environmental outcomes of that are negative, right? So like it's like overwhelming in that way, right? Like, can we encourage people not to live their lives that way? it feels like the cat's out of the bag and like you can't really put it back in. Like, I don't know.
I do think in retrospect, the challenge of circular economy that's been promoted by EU in itself is it's still based on capitalism. It's not a criticism of it, but I think there's two backbone why EU decided to really shift their long-term vision for circular economy. One is the obvious, which is the landfill. The amount of landfill they have is like completely gone, and they had they knew that their landfill will be completely screwed within the next 20 to 30 years. And the second was more about how they wanted to find a entrance to stay competitive against the United States and China, and that was being sustainably advanced. So there's that competition going on, which I don't, which is fine. But ultimately, which is why a lot of the companies are on board with this circular economy thing, right? Philips, 3M, well, 3M's in the United States, sorry, Adidas, a lot of these companies, major companies, including food supplying as well. But there's also a different kind of conversation that's happening within the academic field called the degrowth mentality, degrowth theory, where they would completely cap their economic growth with a certain amount, and they would in one way. I think one entrance is the donut economy is one leeway, but which is to really shift away from GDP based growth and find alternative to measure human thriving or human happiness as an overall. And I think there's a lot of group really trying to find an alternative capitalism, or it doesn't have to be. Most likely it will be capitalism, but I don't know. There's a bunch of conscious capitalism, ethical capitalism. I don't know, the stakeholder capitalism, a bunch of other things, right? But yeah, I think degrowth is something that I look into as a potential way for especially the OECD, G7, G20 countries to look into.
So degrowth, can you, I haven't actually heard that term yet. So it's degrowth what? Just degrowth economies,
I think
like
it's degrowth
structure?
economy, yeah.
And
No, I think
then
it's degrowth society or economy. I think it's either one. I think the university in Utrecht, Utlecht. I think it's either in Belgium or Holland, either one.
It's in the Netherlands, yeah, Holland.
Yeah, Netherlands, yeah. Yeah. I think they had a very interesting seminar last year. I think you can find it on YouTube.
it's interesting.
Yeah, I think, yeah, at least in academia, you're right, degrowth sort of has become something that people are actively exploring. But the only sort of, again, with things like degrowth, it becomes, because of the sort of political and socio-economic climate we're in right now, you know even after COVID would serve to be sort of one of the more bigger social shocks for us. It's just so strange for people to explore like a society without um sort of money as its essence. I think that's the only sort of struggle that not only, that's one of the many struggles that politicians have with the concept of degrowth, and like in general people who are sort of market based have in terms of the concept of degrowth. Because then you so whatever sort of um whatever supremacy that you have over other countries or over other societies now will be gone, because you can't then won't be measurable in terms of like an actual quantity, right? And so when it becomes a little more subjective, that's when sort of people start losing power, essentially. And that's one thing that I think degrowth sort of really scares politicians. That's one way that it scares people who are in power right now. And then that's always going to be a struggle, no matter who's in power. Nobody wants to sort of lose power, essentially. So sort of pushing a concept like degrowth definitely will require a massive effort in terms of like behavioral change. Like that is a given at this point. You can't sort of, it cannot be an immediate thing. It has to be maybe a sort of century long thing, like a 50-year long thing. It's not something that you can immediately build the infrastructure to, immediately build a sort of uh, behavioral capacity for people to handle that. So while that, I mean, it's definitely one of those topics that has to be explored in the future for us to be sustainable in some way or the other. Like there is no way we can sort of go with business as usual and survive essentially, you know. So yeah, I think, and also I think Kate, like I think Mitsu mentioned the Kate Raworth's donut economy model that sort of also fits into that a little bit. I know she's one of the proponents of degrowth, at least from what I've sort of heard from her, Zoom meetings and stuff like that. But yeah, I think those are two sort of things that everybody should definitely maybe look into. I think they'd be very interesting to
Can you say
explore.
it again? The what model?
I put it in the chat. It's
Oh,
called
okay.
Kate Raworth's donut model. Just donut model would be good
Oh,
enough.
donut. Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
So it's very, very interesting to see for sure. Yeah. Any other sort of final or closing comments? Because I think we keep the last 5 minutes to sort of sum it up.
I mean,
And just
definitely, with the post scarcity and a lot of talk about asteroid mining is coming into reality to a lot of these, technocrat in that level. There's definitely a very conflict of interest, and I don't know which side I want to be on, because I'm definitely am excited in the in the sci-fi world, definitely. So it does ring my curiosity, but again, it's all, again, I think when it comes to diversity, discussion about diversity, decentralization and such, is how do we have more a roundtable with various background, various representation of not just within the EU but from all over the world. And you could say that Paris Agreement was definitely the one of the biggest achievement, that we were definitely able to have push aside that the North-South divide, not completely, but it's been it took 20 years to get rid of that thing, right? So I am very hopeful in that sense, to have more to go beyond diversity into plurality and such. So I think, yeah, we'll see. Hopefully the sustainability expert will not be needed within the next 10 years, which would basically mean we'll be out of jobs, but that would be an ideal situation, right? So yeah, that's it for me.
yeah, I think that's one thing we wouldn't mind losing our jobs for sure. Yeah.
Then maybe
Use-
we can go be farmers or robot farmers, I mean.
Yeah. No, I mean, so the link that Mitsu sent actually, it just says from circular economy to circular society. And I think that sums up the sort of essence of it, right? The idea that we're going from an economy based model to a society based model where you have other elements apart from money that you think are important and you think need to be factored into your policy making, your behavior, all of that, So I think, yeah, it's really interesting to see that the entire idea of a circular economy now has to shift, which we already thought was like supposed to be the epitome of sustainability, now has to shift and sort of morph itself into a circular society as well.
Hmm.
So yeah, it's very, very interesting to see for sure.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think a lot of people are just trying to use circularity as their business model because it's like cool, but they don't really put a lot of thought into like the actual outcomes of it. So I hadn't made that connection myself, but I like that. Can you say it again? The
Yeah,
moving
it's in
from
the
a
chat. It says from circular economy to circular society.
society. That's right.
Yeah.
That's great.
So very, very interesting, I think. Yeah. Any other comments from Lauren or Alexis? Okay. Yeah, I think we have about 10 minutes to go. If anybody else wants to say anything at all, Mitsu, if you want to just go ahead and say anything at all, I think number one, we're sort of very happy to have you here. Thank you for joining us at like 3 a.m. It's just, yeah, so very happy to have you. But yeah, I mean, any other comments that you have, anything else, any sort of short sort of insights that you want to share, anything fun that you've seen recently, all of that.
I mean, I do think in the current, United States, I'm glad you guys have passed that, but with the current political climate that's happening with, I think there's sustainability was definitely the 2010 to 2020 was definitely the decade for sustainability to make a very massive progress. But I do think from 2020 to 2030 is, without a doubt, it's about um, um, decentralization and fixing this economic inequality, as well as the empowerment of marginalized communities and group. So I do think what how we could incorporate that will be the next, I think, challenges within the next 10 years, because I think sustainability has found its way to make money now in a good way, but I'm not sure if the wokeness or the woke culture, or basically the I guess like a very radical political movement that's happening in all over the world has found its way into major stream is not is another different question. And I do think that's a very important topic when we talk about, not just the sustainability of the earth or human sustainability of human, but also with the relationship with communities and as well as marginalized communities. That's kind of like my thought for like the next 10 years. I think that's
Like,
really
just to add
important.
to that, yeah, exactly. And like, it's so strange that in this entire conversation, we didn't, except for Mitsu, none of us really mentioned decentralization. But what we did end up describing in our sort of examples of things were essentially community-based solutions, which are the sort of ideal decentralized solutions that we have, which can be sort of then scaled maybe to a city scale or like a local level scale. But it's just so interesting to think that we have those sort of approaches to things. We just don't have the right sort of words to put them into, which are the buzzwords that we see. But yeah, very, very nice to see that everybody sort of has those ideas in terms of, how we think change is going to happen. So yeah.